Welcome to our deep dive session. Today we're exploring the whole idea of land titling and microcredit in Cambodia and how Hernando de Soto's 3 steps to heaven really played out.
I'm really intrigued by that. So, de Soto argued that if the poor secured formal land titles, they could use those as collateral to access microcredit and uplift themselves out of poverty, right?
Exactly, though, it's like de Soto promised a sort of magic bullet, where first you secure your title, then you leverage that into credit, and then you suddenly jump to prosperity through microenterprise. But, as the evidence from Cambodia shows, the first 2 steps were taken, but the third step, that automatic boost to dignity and income, didn't really materialize.
Yeah, I get that. So what actually happened in Cambodia?
Well, over the last couple of decades, Cambodia managed to widely issue land titles, and these were then accepted as collateral by microcredit institutions. As a result, microcredit just exploded, a record-breaking expansion that turned Cambodia into the world's most microcredit-saturated nation. But instead of sparking vigorous microenterprise growth, it created a scenario where the poor ended up being over-indebted.
So the microcredit boom ended up deepening poverty rather than alleviating it?
Precisely. The idea was that more loans would mean more jobs and bigger incomes. However, in practice, many microloans were used not so much for starting or expanding productive activities, but rather largely for consumption, like supporting day-to-day needs. It turned into a cycle where borrowers were forced to refinance just to keep up with payments.
That sounds like a textbook case of a debt trap. Did this lead to any other problems, like forced asset sales?
Definitely. One of the most disconcerting outcomes was the forced sale of land. When borrowers couldn't repay, their land titles were used against them. Instead of empowering people, the collateral mechanism pushed many into losing their land, a core asset that was supposed to be their safety net.
Yeah, that's really troubling. And what about the benefits that de Soto had promised? Improved microenterprise activity and overall local economic development.
That's where it gets even more complicated. While a small segment of the population managed to benefit, think of a few successful microenterprises, the broad picture shows minimal net job creation. In fact, many analyses pointed to stagnating or even declining incomes in overcrowded microenterprise markets. Essentially, the supposedly transformative effect ended up benefiting mainly the financiers and foreign investors.
So it seems like the risk was transferred from the lenders to the borrowers while the returns went to the already privileged groups?
Exactly. The implementation in Cambodia enabled the microcredit institutions to capitalize on nearly universal land titling. It drastically reduced their lending risks. Yet, here's the twist. The resulting profits were later funneled abroad, often through foreign-owned financial institutions. This essentially resulted in what David Harvey called accumulation by dispossession.
Right. Could we say that, in trying to formalize property rights, they inadvertently paved the way for large-scale asset stripping?
Yes, absolutely. Instead of unleashing economic potential, de Soto's model in Cambodia became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided formal recognition for property rights. On the other, it opened a channel for microcredit-driven land dispossession and the deepening of debt cycles.
That's a real irony. What about the studies on microcredit's impact? Were any of them convinced by the microcredit argument?
Well, several early reports, including some commissioned by big institutions like the World Bank, claimed there were positive impacts, like increased work hours at home, reduced child labor, and modest income gains. But many independent evaluations criticized these studies for focusing too much on operational metrics, like the volume of loans disbursed, rather than the actual well-being
that seems like
of
a bit
households.
of a cover-up. So if I understand correctly, the metrics that looked good on paper masked deeper, systematic issues?
Right. It's like measuring success by the sheer number of microloans issued instead of checking if those loans truly generated sustainable, higher-paying jobs. Most households ended up in a vicious loop, taking more loans just to repay previous ones, and then sometimes even forced to sell their land.
That circular trap is really damaging. Isn't that also tied to the neoliberal emphasis on individual entrepreneurship, which De Soto championed?
Exactly. A big part of the critique is that De Soto's model was rooted in neoliberal ideas that overly glorify individual entrepreneurship. In reality, the ground-level dynamics in Cambodia plunged many into deeper poverty because the systemic issues, like over-indebtedness, informal versus formal market competition, and even local government incentives, were never properly addressed.
It almost seems like a misdiagnosis of the underlying root problems. However, some might argue that despite its flaws, formalizing property rights was still a step in the right direction for economic inclusion. What's your take on that?
I get where that critique comes from. On paper, getting formal land titles can certainly provide a legal framework that could boost investor confidence and safeguard property rights. But here's the challenge. If the financial structures built on that framework, like microcredit, channel their benefits mostly to financial elites, then the supposed empowerment of the poor is undermined. It's a case of good intentions being subverted by profit motives.
Yeah, that does sound like a structural failure. And what about the future? With all these issues, is there any hope that Cambodia's system can be reformed or that similar pitfalls can be avoided in other contexts?
That's the big question, isn't it? The studies suggest that without radical changes, the unsustainable expansion of microcredit could, in fact, trigger financial crises resembling what we've seen in other contexts, like the Minsky moments. Failing to reform the system might lead to even more severe credit collapses, more forced land sales, and a further drain of wealth from the poor to foreign investors.
Yay, that kind of scenario would definitely be catastrophic for local communities. But aren't there policy tools that could mitigate these risks? Maybe like stricter regulation on loan practices or better consumer protections?
In theory, yes. Some suggestions include capping interest rates, enforcing stricter lending standards, and even revising the collateral systems so that land cannot be taken away as easily. Also, greater oversight by the government could help rebalance the interests of local borrowers versus foreign investors. But implementing these reforms is quite challenging because the microcredit sector has deep ties with powerful political and economic interests.
That's a tough nut to crack. It really sounds like De Soto's 3 steps promised a utopia that never materialized, at least in Cambodia's case. Would you say that's an accurate summary?
Absolutely. While steps 1 and 2 were largely achieved, in that land, titles became ubiquitous and microcredit expanded dramatically. The promised leap to sustainable local development, improved incomes, and poverty reduction never occurred on a broad scale. Instead, the model generated new vulnerabilities, over-indebtedness, an erosion of property security, and, quite tragically, a channel through which the poorest were dispossessed of their most valuable asset,
That's a sobering conclusion.
their land.
I have to ask, if De Soto's model is so flawed, why do you think it became so globally popular in the first place?
Great question. It largely came down to appealing simplicity and a neoliberal free market ideology that resonated with international institutions and Western governments. The enticing promise was that by simply legalizing property rights, you could release a vast amount of dead capital and spark entrepreneurship. But, the reality turned out to be far more complex. Local contexts, like Cambodia's history, political dynamics, and market conditions, exposed the model's deep flaws.
Yeah, it's clear that one size just doesn't fit all. And what lessons can other developing countries take from Cambodia's experience with land titling and microcredit?
They, must be cautious before blindly adopting models that worked or were thought to work elsewhere. It's crucial to design systems that are tailored to local economic, social, and political environments. Also, a balance is needed between formalizing property and protecting susceptible communities from predatory lending practices and forced dispossession. Essentially, You need to ensure greater accountability and protections so that the financial system truly serves the poor, not just the investors.
Right, because what's meant to empower can easily be misdirected without oversight. It's fascinating and frustrating how such a well-intended theory can lead to such unintended distress.
Absolutely. De Soto's 3 steps to heaven were doomed to hit a snag when the leap from increased credit to real economic uplift was never supported by, the necessary structural change mechanisms. In Cambodia's case, it resulted in a cascade of over-indebtedness, land loss, and ultimately, a deepening of poverty rather than its alleviation.
That chain reaction really underscores the risks. And do you think there's any realistic chance of reversing these trends, or is it more about preventing further damage?
I think it's about both, but especially prevention. Reversing such entrenched dynamics is extremely challenging, particularly when powerful interests are involved. Radical policy reforms and, possibly, a rethinking of how financial services are delivered in these markets are necessary. In the meantime, efforts must certainly be directed at preventing further exploitation and ensuring that credit does not become a tool for further dispossession.
That makes sense. Real systemic change rather than just cosmetic fixes. Well, this has been such an eye-opening discussion. It really shows that economic models need rigorous local testing before being scaled globally.
Absolutely. It's like, a cautionary tale. The promise of formalization and credit expansion must always be critically examined in local contexts. Hopefully, with better oversight and reforms, future strategies can truly empower communities rather than trap them in debt.
Right, here's to learning and then doing better. Thanks for the insightful conversation. It definitely gives us a lot to ponder regarding the intersection of policy, finance, and human well-being.